Volga River, November 19, 1942. The wind cuts through the snow like a blade, slicing across the shattered skeleton of a city that once held 500,000 souls. The ruins of Stalingrad groan under the weight of war, concrete shells, twisted girders, and the blackened bones of factories that once fed the Soviet machine. In the distance, muffled thunder rolls, not from the sky but from the endless artillery of the Red Army, massed in silence for days, now poised to strike. German soldiers huddle in cellars and shell holes, unaware that their greatest nightmare is about to begin. Soviet General Staff Archives, 1942. For weeks, the Sixth Army had been locked in brutal combat, clawing for every street, every building. The Germans called it Rattenkrieg, the War of the Rats. Entire regiments fought for a single staircase, a single floor. Hand grenades, knives, sharpened shovels, anything that killed was sacred. The air smelled of rust, cordite, and frozen blood. In the center of it all, General Friedrich Paulus believed victory was near. Stalingrad was nearly his. Hitler demanded it, yet unseen beyond the river bends. The Red Army had built something vast, something Paulus could not imagine. Oak H. War Diary. Thought 1942. The Soviet plan, codenamed Operation Uranus, was no desperate gamble. It was a calculated trap, drawn in secret by Zhukov and Vasilevsky. For months, the Stavka had studied the German lines. Overextended flanks guarded not by Wehrmacht elites, but by exhausted Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian divisions. Men poorly equipped for the Russian winter. Soviet engineers had assembled pontoon bridges under camouflage nets. Sappers cut ice channels by night, and supply trains rumbled east bringing fuel, tanks, and the new T-34s to forward depots. Soviet Frontline Engineering Report. 1942. Before dawn the storm broke. 1,000 guns opened fire at once. The steppe itself seemed to tremble. Shells fell like rain across 100 miles of front, shattering positions that had been quiet hours earlier. Romanian lines disintegrated within minutes. Infantry companies melted in the blizzard of iron. The Germans' radio traffic spiked into chaos, desperate calls for support drowned by static and screams. Within 24 hours, Soviet armored columns, the 5th Tank Army and 21st Army, were racing west and south, their treads grinding over the snow like iron serpents. U.S. Army Historical Study No. 20, 1948. Paulus didn't yet understand. Reports filtered in. Romanian 3rd Army gone, the flank collapsing. He sent requests to Army Group B for permission to withdraw, but the answer from Hitler's headquarters was clear. Stand fast. Stalingrad must be held. Führer Directive No. 44 Nov 1940. The trap was closing. Soviet spearheads met at Kalak on November 23rd. A steel ring had formed, 22 divisions of Germans, Romanians, and auxiliaries trapped inside. Over 300,000 men encircled, with winter closing in. Soviet General Staff Operational Summary, Nov 1942. Inside the pocket, life turned from exhaustion to terror. Ammunition dwindled, fuel froze, bread was rationed to grams, horses were slaughtered to keep the men alive. The Luftwaffe promised an airlift, but the cold and Soviet flak tore the planes apart. Junkers 52 transports crashed in flames across the steppe. Some never made it back. Only a fraction of the supplies reached the trapped army, 80 tons a day. When 500 were needed, Luftwaffe Logistics Report, DEC 1942. By December, the city itself had become a mausoleum of men. Soviet snipers stalked the ruins like ghosts, names whispered with dread. Zaitsev, Chekhov, Popov. German soldiers took shelter in the basements of burned-out buildings, eating snow to survive. Every shadow could hide an enemy. Every silence was a prelude to death. Entire companies vanished in the night. In Paulus's headquarters, a basement under the Univermag department store, maps showed the shrinking perimeter, red arrows tightening like a noose. German 6th Army situation map, Jan 1943. The city was a nightmare of contrasts. Above, the Soviets pushed relentlessly, street by street, sometimes advancing only meters a day. Below, the Germans fought with the fatalism of the damned. The once mighty Wehrmacht, that had swept through France, Poland, and the Balkans, now froze and starved in the ruins of a Soviet industrial town. The balance of the entire Eastern Front had shifted, though few yet realized it. For the first time, Hitler's armies were trapped, and no miracle of blitzkrieg could save them. Far away in Moscow, Stalin received the reports with grim satisfaction. "The fascists are learning the cost of their arrogance," he is said to have muttered, Pravda Dek, 1942. Yet even within Soviet ranks, the price was horrific. Casualties among rifle divisions approached 90% in some sectors. The Volga ran red with blood and oil. Hospitals overflowed, and frostbite claimed more lives than bullets. Still, replacements came. Peasants, factory workers, students, thrown into the furnace to hold the ring. Every hour mattered. On December 12th, the Germans attempted one last hope, Operation Winter Storm. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein launched his relief army from Kotelnikovo, striking north with the 4th Panzer Army. It advanced fast, 30 miles in days, but the Soviets countered with ferocity. The temperature dropped to 25 degrees, fuel gelled in tanks, engines stalled. Manstein could hear Paulus's pleas over the radio. "The wounded are freezing to death. Supplies almost gone." But the gap between them, 50 miles, never closed. Army Group Don Records, Dec, 1942. By Christmas, the fate of the 6th Army was sealed. The Soviets tightened their grip, launching Operation Ring in January 1943. It was no longer a battle, it was extermination. Every Soviet shell fell with the precision of vengeance. German soldiers burned their own maps and diaries to stay warm. When Soviet loudspeakers offered surrender, Paulus refused, bound by Hitler's madness. On January 31st, Soviet forces stormed his command post. The once proud field marshal stood trembling in his greatcoat, surrounded by Red Army troops. His empire of ruins gone. Soviet 64th Army Report, Jan, 1943. In Berlin, Hitler raged. He promoted Paulus to field marshal the night before, expecting him to die rather than surrender. Instead, Paulus capitulated, the first German field marshal ever taken alive. "The battle is lost," his message read simply, German Army Archives, 1943. For Germany, Stalingrad was more than defeat. It was the death of the myth of invincibility, of destiny, of the unstoppable Wehrmacht. Across Europe, the world saw the tide turn. Yet beneath the snow and rubble, something else had taken root, an unspoken question. How had the Red Army, thought broken a year before, orchestrated such a devastating reversal? How had an army once retreating from Moscow surrounded and annihilated one of Germany's best? What was the hidden engine of this triumph? The secret weapon not of steel but of coordination, logistics and willpower? The answer lay deep behind the front lines, in the factories of the Urals, the workshops of Gorky and Chelyabinsk, the radio rooms of Moscow, where engineers, soldiers, and citizens built the invisible backbone of a new kind of warfare. What the world saw at Stalingrad was not only the courage of men, it was the rise of a machine. Not a single weapon, but an entire network of endurance, steel, and industrial will. The Red Army's hidden advantage had been forged long before the Volga froze. It was the convergence of logistics, technology, and doctrine, an understanding that wars of annihilation could only be won by overwhelming systems, not heroic gestures. Soviet Defense Industry Bulletin, 1943. After the disasters of 1941, Stalin's government uprooted 1,500 factories and moved them east, beyond the reach of German bombers. It was an operation unlike any in history. Trains 20 miles long carried turbines, presses, furnaces, and workers to the Urals and Siberia. Cities like Chelyabinsk, Sverdlovsk, and Magnitogorsk became vast foundries of survival. By mid-1942, over 11 million laborers, many of them women and teenagers, worked around the clock under floodlights that never dimmed. Soviet Industrial Relocation Report, 1942. The Germans believed the Soviet industry was crippled. In reality, it had doubled its output. Here, the T-34 became the symbol of Soviet rebirth. Designed by Mikhail Koshkin and Alexander Morozov at the Kharkov locomotive plant, its sloped armor deflected shells that shattered lesser tanks. It weighed 26 tons, carried a 76.2mm gun, and could reach 34 mph on open ground, nearly twice the speed of a Panzer IV in snow. Technical Manual TM 9803, 1943. More important was how it was built, simple, modular, and repairable in the field. Welders could assemble one in under 8,000 man-hours, half the German requirement for a panzer. Every rivet, every track link was designed for mass production, not perfection. Factory number 183 production log. 1942. This was the Soviet secret. Machines that could survive the front and factories that could not be bombed. German engineers mocked Soviet simplicity until they saw it outrun their precision. They fight with tractors made of armor, wrote a stunned German technician after inspecting a captured T-34, Bundesarchiv, Maintenance Diary, 1943. Yet what truly broke the Wehrmacht was not the T-34 alone, but what surrounded it, the Red Army's re-engineered command and communication network. In 1942, Soviet signal officers, guided by engineers from the Moscow Institute of Electrical Communication, introduced new portable radio sets, the 9R and RBM models. Filled with rugged vacuum tubes and insulated casings, they operated at frequencies between 4.0 and 5.2 MHz, with a range of up to 15 kilometers under combat conditions. Red Army Signal Corps Manual, 1942. These radios connected tanks, artillery, and infantry for the first time in coherent tactical webs. Orders could now flow in minutes instead of hours. Coordination replaced chaos. Before Stalingrad, Soviet divisions had fought in isolation, often blind once battle began. But during Operation Uranus, entire corps maneuvered like a single organism. A tank commander could call down artillery within seconds. Supply units could adjust routes in real time. For the Germans, whose armored units relied heavily on line-of-sight signaling or pre-arranged plans, the speed of Soviet response was terrifying. "They seem to know our next move before we make it," one German officer recorded. 6th Army Diary, Nov, 1942. While the front blazed, another silent force moved behind it, the Soviet logistics train. In Moscow, the People's Commissariat of Transportation directed an empire of railways that fed the front with mathematical precision. The legendary Stalingrad run hauled 1,200 trainloads per month, delivering 90,000 tons of ammunition, 60,000 tons of food, and 150,000 replacement troops between October and December alone, NKPS Transport Report, 1943. Soviet railway engineers invented mobile repair units and heated track switches to keep lines open in 30-degree conditions. Even snowstorms became tactical weapons. Trains ran at night without lights, vanishing into the blizzard's veil. Amid this storm of machinery came human ingenuity. Soviet factories churned out variants of the Katyusha rocket launcher, the BM-13, mounted on simple Z-6 trucks. Its 132mm rockets screamed across the sky, saturating enemy lines in seconds. Each salvo fired 16 rockets in under 10 seconds, striking targets up to 5 kilometers away. Weapons of the Red Army, 1943. German infantry called them Stalin's organs for their wailing sound. Though inaccurate, they devastated morale and communication. "It feels like the earth itself is roaring," one Romanian survivor wrote. Romanian Third Army Memoir, 1946. On December 16, 1942, one such barrage opened the Battle of the Chir River. Manstein's relief force, comprising the 57th Panzer Corps, attempted to break north toward the encircled 6th Army. Facing them was the Soviet 5th Shock Army, equipped with new radio-linked Katyusha batteries and mobile anti-tank units. The battle unfolded under a sky of ice and fire. German panzers advanced across the frozen steppe, engines whining, when Soviet spotters relayed coordinates by encrypted Morse bursts. Within minutes, hundreds of rockets screamed down. The snow erupted in orange flame and shrapnel. Soviet artillery log, Deck 1942. Tank duels followed at ranges of less than 300 meters. Soviet T-34s, guided by real-time radio commands, encircled isolated German units. The Red Army's coordination, once its greatest weakness, had become its blade. Over 5 days of combat, Manstein lost 40% of his armor and 12,000 men. The 6th Army could hear the guns in the distance, but remained cut off. Paulus begged for an air corridor to open. None came. "We can hear them dying out there," he radioed. "And soon it will be us." German 6th Army radio transmission log, Deck 1942. In the aftermath of Chir, Soviet commanders began applying their new doctrine systematically. Concentrated shock groups, flexible artillery control, and combined arms synchronized by wireless coordination. It was a doctrine not born in academies but in necessity, battlefield Darwinism. Zhukov called it the rhythm of iron, and his staff analyzed every engagement with scientific rigor. Errors were catalogued, frequencies refined, logistics recalculated. Soviet Military Science Journal, 1943. The Red Army was no longer reactive, it was adaptive. The Germans tried to respond. Their engineers fielded improved Fu G5 radios and heavier armor, but their production lines could not match Soviet scale. Where Germany produced 1,200 tanks a month at its 1942 peak, the Soviets built 2,500, many in factories constructed less than a year earlier. In Chelyabinsk, nicknamed Tankograd, 1 in every 5 tanks rolling from the assembly halls went straight to Stalingrad. Mechanics worked 16-hour shifts, welding plates under the light of gas torches that burned blue through the frost. Chelyabinsk Metallurgical Plant Report, 1943. By January 1943, when Operation Ring commenced, the Soviet machine was in perfect rhythm. Artillery batteries shifted fire by radio relay, tank brigades coordinated in 3 dimensions, and supply trains mirrored the front's every move. The encircled Germans, cut off from fuel and command, had no such harmony. Their radio frequencies were jammed, their maps outdated, their units skeletal. "Our tanks stand silent," wrote one captain in his final note. "We are frozen in place while the enemy moves like fire over ice." Bundesarchiv, Captain Ernst Weber Diary. Jan, 1943. When Soviet troops finally overran Paulus's headquarters, they discovered immaculate German records. Every casualty, every ration, every shell counted. Yet their precision meant nothing against Soviet relentlessness. The balance of war had shifted not by chance, but by system, an industrial orchestra playing the symphony of total war. Still, beyond the guns and machines, another transformation was taking shape. A shift not only in tactics but in psychology. Stalingrad had shattered Germany's faith in victory, but for the Soviet Union it awakened something primal: belief. Soldiers who once doubted now marched with conviction. The factory worker became as vital as the front-line sniper. Engineers and generals spoke in the same language: production, coordination, survival. The war was no longer about who could fight harder, but who could endure longer. And as the frozen ruins of Stalingrad fell silent in February 1943, both sides sensed it, the beginning of the end for Germany in the East. Yet the true weight of that victory, and the scars it left on those who bore it, were only beginning to emerge. When the guns finally fell silent over Stalingrad, what remained was not victory, it was a void, a hollow silence where once the earth had roared. The city was gone, its skyline erased by fire and steel. Over 1 million soldiers and civilians lay buried beneath the rubble. Yet in that desolation, history pivoted. For the first time in the war, Germany was on the defensive, and for the Soviet Union, the impossible had become inevitable. The world's eyes turned eastward, to the banks of the Volga. Where an empire of endurance had defeated an empire of ambition, U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey. 1946. In the weeks that followed the German surrender on February 2, 1943, the Red Army began to absorb what it had achieved. Entire fronts were reorganized, new offensives drawn on maps still stained with soot. Over 91,000 German soldiers trudged into captivity, frozen, starving, carrying their wounded comrades through the snow. Only about 5,000 of them would ever return to Germany. Soviet POW records, 1943. The rest vanished into the vast labor camps of the East. For Hitler, Stalingrad was a psychic wound from which his strategy would never recover. "The gods of war have turned their backs," noted Joseph Goebbels in his diary. The tone shifting from triumph to dread. Reich Propaganda Ministry records, 1943. But beyond the loss of men and material, Stalingrad broke something deeper, the Wehrmacht's aura of invincibility. The same officers who had marched through Paris now fought retreating battles through snow and ruin. The defeat reverberated through every front, from North Africa to the Atlantic. German generals, once confident in Blitzkrieg's rhythm of lightning strikes, began to realize the truth. The Soviets had mastered a different tempo, one of attrition, momentum, and unrelenting replacement. For every tank Germany lost, the Soviets produced 2. For every pilot downed, another trainee stepped into the cockpit within weeks. War had become a science of endurance. Soviet engineers and factory workers now stood beside soldiers in the pantheon of heroes. The name Tankergrad became legend. Chelyabinsk's forges producing one T-34 every 40 minutes. By mid-1943, Chelyabinsk Factory Production Report, 1943. Women wielded welding torches beside assembly lines, their faces blackened with soot. Children carried shell casings. Technicians worked by candlelight during power outages. Their labor became the unseen weapon that carried the Red Army from defense to dominance. Stalin's toast to the workers of the rear, to those who forged our victory with steel and sweat, was more than rhetoric. It was the truth of a nation that had industrialized itself to survive. Kremlin Address, Feb 1943. In psychological terms, the shift was seismic. Soviet morale, once brittle and uncertain, hardened into something elemental. Reports from the front described a transformation in discipline and confidence. Units that once broke under pressure now held fast. "We fight not for orders," one sergeant wrote, "but for revenge for the comrades frozen in the ruins." Frontline Letter Collection, 1943. For the Germans, the opposite occurred. Post-war interrogations revealed the onset of despair among officers at Stalingrad's fall. "It was as if a curtain had dropped," recalled General der Panzertruppe Hermann Balck. "We knew the war was lost, we just didn't know when." U.S. Army Psychological Warfare Division, 1946. Strategically, Stalingrad reshaped the entire Eastern Front. Hitler's fixation on holding the city had bled his reserves dry, draining the Army Group Center and leaving the southern flank open. Within months, the Soviets launched Operation Bagration, an offensive that annihilated the German Army Group Center with the same encirclement tactics perfected at Stalingrad. Soviet staff officers referred to it as the Child of Uranus, a direct descendant of the encirclement doctrine born in 1942, Soviet General Staff Study 1944. The formula was simple but devastating: fix, flank, encircle, annihilate. It worked because the Red Army could now coordinate across hundreds of miles with precision that rivaled even the Western Allies. Meanwhile, the Soviet psychological advantage deepened. For German soldiers, every village east of the Dnieper became another Stalingrad waiting to happen. Desertion and self-inflicted wounds rose sharply. Propaganda units reported growing cynicism toward Hitler's speeches. The promise of easy victory had turned to grim survival. By 1944, the average lifespan of a German infantryman on the Eastern Front was 12 weeks. Wehrmacht Medical Corps Statistics, 1944. For the Red Army, that same year marked a reversal of fortune so absolute that Soviet commanders began planning offensives into Poland and Romania, their confidence now unshakable. Stalingrad also transformed the Western Allies' perception of Soviet power. Before, Britain and the United States had doubted the USSR's endurance. Afterward, the Red Army was recognized as a peer force, one capable of bearing the main burden of the war. Churchill called it the hinge of fate, while Roosevelt described it as the turning of the tide for civilization. Allied Leaders Correspondence, 1943. American Lend-Lease shipments accelerated. Thousands of Studebaker trucks, P-39 Cobras, and tons of aviation fuel poured into Soviet ports. These vehicles became lifelines for Soviet logistics, bridging the industrial gap and connecting the vast distances of the Eastern Front. U.S. Lend-Lease Report, 1944. Yet even in triumph, the human cost was almost beyond comprehension. Soviet casualty records list over 1 million dead and wounded at Stalingrad alone. Civilians who survived the siege emerged from cellars blinded by sunlight, walking among the ruins like ghosts. Dogs scavenged the bodies frozen into the streets. Of the city's pre-war population, only about 1,500 residents were found alive in February 1943, NKVD Civil Affairs Report, 1943. The victory that saved the Soviet Union had also devoured an entire generation. It was a paradox that haunted every survivor, a triumph built on sacrifice so vast it defied meaning. In Berlin, the psychological unraveling of Nazi command deepened. Hitler's relationship with his generals fractured. Distrust replaced delegation. The Führer began micromanaging divisions from his Wolf's Lair bunker, issuing impossible stand-fast orders, as if willpower alone could reverse the tide. The ghost of Stalingrad haunted every decision. No retreat, he thundered before Kursk, before Normandy, before the Ardennes, each time invoking Stalingrad as both warning and delusion. Führer Headquarters Directives, 1943-1944. The seeds of his downfall were sown not in the streets of Berlin, but in the frozen cellars of Stalingrad. As the Red Army pushed westward in 1944 and 1945, Stalingrad became more than history, it became myth. Soviet films, posters, and parades transformed the battle into a symbol of collective will. The city itself was rebuilt not as it had been, but as a monument. The Mamayev Kurgan, once a hill drenched in blood, rose again crowned by a colossal statue. The motherland calls. Her sword lifted to the sky, her face carved in grief and defiance. Beneath her feet lay the bones of 35,000 soldiers. Volgograd Reconstruction Report, 1967. For every visitor, the message was clear. The Soviet people had not merely survived, they had triumphed through suffering. In the West, Stalingrad became a case study in total warfare. Military academies analyzed its every movement, the encirclement patterns, the logistics chain, the urban tactics that foreshadowed modern warfare. From Korea to the Persian Gulf, generals would cite Stalingrad when discussing urban combat, morale under siege, and the primacy of logistics over maneuver. It became a blueprint not of how to fight, but how to endure. Modern doctrine, network-centric warfare, real-time command, integrated logistics, all trace faint echoes back to that city on the Volga, U.S. Army Command and General Staff College lecture. 92. And yet, beyond the maps and memorials, Stalingrad remains something more profound, a warning. It showed that wars are not won by technology alone, nor by ideology, but by the will to outlast the storm. It revealed the fragility of arrogance and the strength of unity. The Red Army's victory was not the triumph of one man, but of millions, soldiers, workers, engineers, and mothers who refused to yield. As dawn broke over the Volga months later, smoke still rose from the ruins. The frozen river glistened like glass, reflecting the pale sun of a war not yet over. But in that moment, the outcome was already written. Germany's eastward march had ended where it began, in the heart of Russia, against a people who would not break. Stalingrad, said one Soviet veteran years later, standing before the rebuilt city was not a battle. It was the moment we learned that no empire can conquer those who fight for home. In modern war, connection outweighs firepower, and endurance defeats ambition.